None of the technology is ever going to take the place of people. It's never going to replace human intelligence, human intuition. It just helps inform that. Computers are not, none of these models are magic. They're not doing anything secret. It's just that the computer can go through a lot of information much more quickly than a person can. And in Chicago, we have so much data, so much information, so many cameras, so many sensors providing input, all this real-time information that we decided that we needed a place where that could all come together and be acted upon. So those officers that are staffing the rooms, and there is also a civilian in the center. For the first time, we hired civilian criminal intelligence analysts. Those officers rotate in and out of the room, so they're in touch with the community. They're on the street. They're also in the rooms. It's kind of a rotation. So does not take the place of that. Just helps empower it, enable it, inform it, and we think make it more effective.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations.
Welcome to the museum. I'm so excited to be here. Is this a first time for anybody else in the audience? It's my first. Okay, I'm totally circling back. This space is so beautiful and incredible. We've done stories on it and we watched the construction, but I'm in the county, so I hadn't had a chance to get down here yet. And I was like, wow, even when I drove by, I was like, wow, that's a beautiful, oh, that's where I'm going, great. So this is great. Thank you all for having us here today. And we're gonna have a conversation about something that's really important. And the whole idea here is to have a dialogue to learn more about policing, how it's working in our communities, and how technology is impacting the policing that we're seeing every day. So this is about predictive policing, forecasting crime with big data, National Law Enforcement Museum, putting this together for us. So again, give them a round of applause for having a good community discussion for all of us to learn more about technology and how it's working. So I just want to start with a brief definition of predictive policing. It reminds me a lot of like the precogs in Minority Report, right? And we saw that in that movie, there were some glitches in the precogs. But then, there were some incidents that came across, the way that they were supposed to when they were policing them in the movie. But, now we're living in an age where technology can kind of do the same thing. And that's a lot of what is going on with predictive policing. So just a little bit of a definition here before we begin. In November of 2011, Time magazine named predictive policing as one of the 50 best inventions of 2011. In the United States, the practice of predicting policing has been implemented by police departments all across the country, including Los Angeles, including Chicago. We're going to have a conversation about that in just a bit. But predictive policing, according to the National Institute of Justice, is the application of advanced analytics to data sets in conjunction with intervention methods. It's very technical. It's not a replacement of traditional policing models, but an enhancement of existing approaches. So to help us in this conversation, we're joined by Professor Andrew Ferguson. He is a national expert on juries, predictive policing, and the Fourth Amendment. He currently teaches and writes in the area of criminal law, criminal procedure, and evidence at the David A. Clark School of Law at the University of D.C. His most recent book, The Rise of Big Data Policing, Surveillance, Race, and the Future of Law Enforcement, examines how surveillance technology and predictive analytics shapes modern policing. Please, everyone, give Mr. Ferguson a round of applause joining us today. Reverend Tony Lee is the founder and senior pastor of the Community of Hope AME Church in Hillcrest Heights. He is, the Community of Hope is recognized throughout the region for its innovative ministry, social engagement, and community outreach. The congregation has also gained national attention for its work around HIV/AIDS, violence prevention, community police partnerships, and educational advocacy. And I can tell you, as the bureau chief for NBC4 in Washington, we spend a lot of time at this church when we're dealing with community issues. This is one of those hands-on churches, so it's really great to see you here, Reverend Lee. Thank you for joining us. And Chief Jonathan Lewin he oversees the Bureau of Technical Services and serves as Chief Information Officer for the Chicago Police Department, the second largest municipal law enforcement agency in the United States. He has been a sworn member of the CPD since 1991. He has also detailed to the position of Managing Deputy Director for the City of Chicago Office of Emergency Management and Communications. For 4 years, his portfolio includes surveillance cameras, gunshot detection, mobile platforms, voice and data communication systems, license plate recognition, geographic information systems, predictive policing, and business intelligence functions. And as you can see, we've got the folks here who we need to have here to help us out in this discussion. We're going to begin with a video that Chief Lewin has made available for us. So let's go ahead and start with that video.
The Strategic Decision Support Center is a district-based high-tech nerve center that ties together operational intelligence from a host of sources. SDSC personnel use data analysis and technology tools to provide insight for decision-making. A geo-based mapping system provides situational awareness. Crime forecasting software identifies areas that are most at risk for violence, and gunshot detection sensors enable officers to respond more quickly to shots fired incidents. Field officers are now equipped with mobile devices to receive information from these systems in real time. By surfacing patterns in the data, the SDSCs enable commanders to deploy officers more efficiently. The analysis centers on locations prone to violence and on repeat offenders. Once the people and places most at risk are identified, SDSC personnel develop mission parameters based on available resources. After the commander has made the final decision on where to focus attention and the actions to be taken, the missions are disseminated to field units. As field officers complete their missions, they collect data and intelligence that's transmitted back to SDSC personnel for analysis and inclusion in briefings, providing a 360-degree feedback loop. By constantly analyzing what has been most and least effective in this iterative mission-based process, solutions are constantly being evaluated and optimized. The ultimate goal of the SDSCs is to provide a process and an environment for collaboration and analysis, resulting in fewer victims. Strategic Decision Support Center. Smarter policing, fewer victims.
All right. So I'd like to begin my questions with Chief Lewin. And, just looking at the video, we're seeing these officers and they're looking at computers and they're in a room. And the first thing that I think is they're away from the community in a room. So what happened to walking the beat, and how has technology impacted that good old-fashioned common sense policing?
Well, the first point is that it does not replace it, it enhances it, it supports it. None of the technology is ever going to take the place of people. It's never going to replace human intelligence, human intuition. It just helps inform that. Computers are not, none of these models are magic. They're not doing anything secret. It's just that the computer can go through a lot of information much more quickly than a person can. And in Chicago, we have so much data, so much information, so many cameras, so many sensors providing input, all this real-time information that we decided that we needed a place where that could all come together and be acted upon. So those officers that are staffing the rooms, and there is also a civilian in the center. For the first time, we hired civilian criminal intelligence analysts. Those officers rotate in and out of the room, so they're in touch with the community. They're on the street. They're also in the rooms. It's kind of a rotation. So does not take the place of that. Just helps empower it, enable it, inform it, and we think make it more effective.
When did Chicago start predictive policing? Can you talk a little bit about the history the department has of this?
We started with a person-based risk model, which we called, and it was a terrible name, our strategic subjects list. List is in the name, but it wasn't a list. I was doing a talk show with the ACLU at one point a couple of years ago, and the rep from the ACLU said, well, this is a list. You've got people on this list. And I said, well, it's not really a list. And they said, well, then how come list is in the name? So that was kind of tough to counter. So one thing we did is we changed the name. We're now calling it the Subject Assessment and Information Dashboard, which the professor brought along. So I knew he was going to bring it up. So LIST is not in the name. We started this a couple of years ago. I think the first, and these are all Department of Justice grant funded, initially from the National Institute of Justice, now from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. The first NIJ grant was, I believe, in 2013. And we're now on this is basically our 6th model of the person-based prediction. This just rolled out. January, so the professor knows. All of our orders are public, by the way, so this is in the interest of transparency. If you go to directives.chicagopolice.org, you can find this order and all the other policies and orders. So that was the person-based prediction. We started place-based prediction in 2017.
You know, when I hear person-place prediction, place prediction, I'm thinking, okay, so we have computers, and computers are doing this work. And my question is, who's programming the computers? What's going into the computers? How is that working? Professor, can you jump in here on the question of bias and how that plays into having computers that are helping with the policing in these communities?
Sure. And just to step back, I mean, what you see in that video is really a revolution in how policing is going forward. And you're doing it in the beginning. And whether good, bad, scary, brilliant, it's really changing where police are going on their daily basis. It's changing who they're interacting with and who's on this, I still call it the strategic subject list, the heat list. And it's changing a relationship between police and communities. And it's something that we should be having a conversation about, which I'm glad we are here, because of issues of bias, because of issues of transparency, and because it's actually just changing policing. And we should be thoughtful about how technology will change that officer who's in the patrol car looking at their smartphone, just like the smartphone has changed every one of us, how it's going to change them, and asking questions of, can we trust the data that is coming in here? Are we sure we've set up metrics and measures to make sure it's accurate? Are we concerned that bias could find its way into the system? And then how we check. And so to get to your question of bias, so one of the earlier models of this sort of person-based predictive policing, right? This idea that we can identify individuals who are more at risk for violence, either as a victim, like someone who actually might get shot, or as a perpetrator, someone who might do the shooting, was using a series of inputs. And right, you gotta be careful with your inputs. And some of those inputs are arrests. And right, so in the early iterations, they had arrests for narcotics, gun violence, weapons, as well as whether you've been a victim of a violent crime, your age at the last arrest, and kind of this trend line was going up or down. And some of those variables in Chicago are imbued with a racial cast, right? Chicago has an unpleasant history of race. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division went in there and wrote a report that you guys are still working with on the consent decree about some of the structural racial problems there, right? And so if some of your inputs are arrests, and arrests are kind of proxies a lot for where police are patrolling and what they're doing, you have to worry, and you have to take steps to make sure that you're not just sort of reifying it. Now, when you're intentional about it, and when you're thinking about it, this can do a better job of identifying those people who are most at risk, right? Risk is not evenly identified, evenly spread out across society. There are people who are more at risk, and they tend in Chicago to correlate with communities of color and poor communities. And so it's complicated, but it's also something that deserves like a sustained conversation to make sure you are not just simply taking the fancy toys, and it looks really cool, and really interrogating, how do we get this data? Has the community been brought in? Do we understand how it's going to impact how the officers are seeing their community? I can talk some more about how I, as a law professor, how I see sort of the law changing. But I think it is important to recognize that underlying that data are concerns about bias. Doesn't mean it's racist, doesn't mean it should be thrown out, but it means that there are hard questions to be asked.
And you mentioned the communities that this kind of work would really impact. So we're talking about communities of color, we're talking about social economic issues in some instances. So Reverend Lee, I have to ask you, when you hear analytics and you hear we're basing this on crime statistics, do you also hear the possibility of over-policing in communities like a Hillcrest Heights, where your church is located?
Well, I hear a couple of things. One, over-policing. Two, I have questions, concerns about what it deals with, this kind of slippery slope of reasonable suspicion. That if the computer says that you may be suspicious before you've actually done something suspicious, then there's a whole slippery slope there that's very dangerous. And I say that having been a black man in America who, when I was in seminary, was in New York City and had gone one day to get some chicken from the chicken place. It was cold. I had on a big coat, and I was walking back up Broadway, 125th and Broadway, because I was at Union Theological Seminary right up the street from Harlem. And some gentlemen, some police officers, plainclothes, jump out of a car, snatch me up, and slam me up against, start patting me down. And they feel the chicken and scout gun, and I holler, no, chicken. I mean, just really, no, chicken. And at that point, I realized I had to use any connection I had to white privilege. And I had to say, I am a student at the Union Theological Seminary. If you go in my pocket, you will see my identification. It's in my right pocket. Now, what I remember most about this was during the period of stop and frisk in New York. It was a new kind of a policing kind of an effort. It was having, and for some, it was a great kind of a thing. But for some communities, it was just terror. And so here I am, this master's student in seminary, and I'll never forget it. Remember the officer saying to me, once they saw who I was, all right, you go ahead, and next time, don't act so nervous. One, next time.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah.
And two, how am I supposed to feel about 4 white men in plainclothes jumping out of a hoopty, slamming me up? I had to do like arithmetic. I had to do, calculus in my head and say, either I'm getting robbed. If I'm getting robbed, I'll just get robbed in public. But if I run and they are police, I'm getting shot. That kind of a piece. The reason I say that is because, and what they said was, we got a report that it was a black man in a black coat.
Right.
Okay? This concept of they could just run out, jump out of me. I had done nothing suspicious. I was just walking up the street. But because I was a black man in a black coat, close enough to Harlem, then that made me suspicious enough to get snatched up, slammed up, and have to worry about and do this calculus in my head about how to stay alive. That is what is a big concern for me when now it won't just be them, but it can be a computer back at headquarters that's saying in that area there are black men in black coats, or there's some extra crimes there, and I can just be walking up the street, but I become, the suspicion of me jumps up, and the ability to jump out on me is now quantified. So that then when I'm arguing in court, they had no reason to come and jump out at me. They said, well, no, the computer said.
Right.
And it allowed us to then send other folks. And so that's a big concern from a community standpoint.
Which is a segue into law, and I want to discuss that. But Chief, I want to bring you back in and ask you a question about this, because there are two sides to this argument. Some saying it's best that officers don't have too much information because it can influence how they react in the community. It can influence who they're arresting and whether they arrest them or whether they give them a warning and let them go. And then there are others who say give as much information as possible so that the officers can make the right decisions in the field. Where do you stand in this discussion of how much is too much information?
Well, first, I think it's fitting that we're having this conversation in the National Law Enforcement Museum, because if you walk through the exhibits, you'll get a sense of history and the history of policing, and you'll determine that these kinds of techniques, these kinds of strategies have been used since the days of Sir Robert Peel. All the computer is doing things faster. Again, if the four of us got together and said, what do we think are the risk factors for somebody to be involved in the cycle of violence, you would probably say, if somebody's been shot, that may tend to increase the risk that they would get shot again. You might say, if somebody started their criminal activity at 10 years old, that probably increases their risk a little bit. If somebody has been arrested and charged with a weapons-related offense, that probably increases their risk. Those things all do increase their risk. And to the Reverend's point, this is not an enforcement tool. The person-based model it's an intervention tool to try to work with social service providers to get people out of the cycle of violence. To the professor's point, he's right. Unfortunately, in Chicago, as in many other big cities and other places in the U.S., most of the violence is very concentrated in areas of high poverty. There's a cycle of violence. Today's victim is often tomorrow's offender. Chicago has a very entrenched criminal street gang problem with many criminal gang members that commit violent crimes. This model is designed to save lives. The reason that we developed it is to try to save lives. The reason that we developed and implemented the technology that you saw in that video was to save lives, and we've saved lives. That technology, which really focuses on place-based prediction, not person-based prediction. In fact, this is probably the last version of this model that we'll create. There's probably a level that you're going to reach with the data that we're allowed to use, and there's all sorts of privacy controls in place. So there's some data that we can't use, but the data that we just talked about is objective measures of arrest, objective measures of victimization. If you've been shot, you're a victim. Unfortunately, that increases your risk for being victimized again. This is probably as effective as the model is going to get. What I think needs to be focused on now is what do you do with it and how do you intervene to save lives? So on the person-based side, we're really, in many ways in the police department, shifting the focus to place-based prediction, which I think there's still a lot more potential for, using a variety of inputs to come up with place-based risk models. And one last point is, this is not a list. This is a risk model. Everybody has some level of risk. Everybody in this room has some risk. I have risk, you have risk, you have risk. Some people have higher risk, some people have lower risk. All this model does is say, these people have come to our attention for the following reasons, and the model indicates what those reasons are. They're at increased risk for violence. Is there something that we can do to try to save their life? That's what it's about.
And so your feeling is the more information, the better. The more information an officer has on the street, the better.
So there's a couple caveats to that. One is that the information has to be actionable, so it has to be useful and consumable to the officer. You want to stay away from information overload where you're giving them too much. One of the things we learned with our Strategic Decision Support Center project, which is what the video is about, is there has to be a very consumable, actionable tool for the officers to react to information, both strategically and tactically. So, for example, we've got smartphones in their hands. We can't push too much information to them or it's going to be overload. So it's meaningful information on things like ShotSpotter, which detects a gunshot event and directs them to the location. That's a critical life safety event that they need to know about. The risk model is where should they pay special attention to because we think that this geography might be at risk for future violence. That's pushed out to them. Obviously, calls for service, things like wanted people, wanted vehicles, that's all pushed to them. It's not all information, and there's a lot of information that we can't use for a wide range of reasons, but allowable, actionable information that makes a difference to make them more effective is what we should use.
Professor, let's talk about the law, or the courts, and how this is impacting what happens with sentencing and what the Reverend brought up. Can this kind of technology make its way into into a state's attorney's office?
So generally speaking, this kind of place-based prediction or even person-based prediction doesn't necessarily make it directly into court or even the prosecutor's office. What can happen is if you are put on this, if you're given a risk score and not on a list, and you're high enough, you actually might be called in by the state's attorney to a community meeting at a church or a community center to essentially be told, like, you all are on this list. We are identifying you. There are services to your left. There's prison to your right. Choose wisely which path you take. And the consequence can be that if someone then makes a mistake and gets back into the system, the consequence for the prosecutor they could bring harsher penalties or harsher sentences or those. So it's indirect. There haven't been that many cases involving like a hotspot predicted place and a stop based on that prediction, and that becomes a litigated Fourth Amendment issue. But it is, to your point earlier, distorting some of how officers might see their area, right? So you can imagine if you have your smartphone and you're told to go following like a HunchLab tip. HunchLab's one of the companies that do it. And you're told to go to this area to be on the lookout for burglaries because there's a predicted likelihood there'll be more burglaries in this area at this time. As you drive in that neighborhood, you're going to be looking for burglars, right? Because you've been told to be on the lookout for this particular crime at this particular time. That can have an impact on how you see the world, how you see the community members who are in this world, and how you might see reasonable suspicion, as you brought up. But there are interesting things you can do with the technologies. For example, one of the experiments that HunchLab is running is it used to be that they literally, in their early, I don't think it's in Chicago necessarily, but in their earlier computer systems, you would literally be driving in your squad car and the colors would change on your iPad. So you'd be driving through a high aggravated assault area, and then you go into a high burglary area, and you go to high theft area, and literally the colors would change. And so you'd be looking for whatever that next thing was. And I think what HunchLab has done in some ways is actually sort of blind the officers, like still nudge them in the right place, but not necessarily tell them why, because they were worried, because people like me were criticizing them about that this was going to distort how you'd see the world. So technology can still add, and if you're an officer, you might feel two ways about this. Actually, you're not being told all the information people do know for your own benefit, which is sort of, I don't know, that's above my pay grade. But like, you actually are putting people in the right place at the right time, but not necessarily creating the same distortion as I have critiqued that could affect, Fourth Amendment suspicion and the rest.
I have a question, and Chief, you can jump in on this, or Professor, you can jump in on this. I would imagine that if you are looking at a computer that's telling you where to go for, let's say, there are a lot of shootings in this area, there are a lot of homicides, I would imagine that as a chief, managing my resources, I would put my officers who I believe could handle that kind of situation the best in those areas. And I would also imagine that if we're dealing with other kinds of crimes, quality of life crimes, or some of these other things that officers in that vicinity may have to respond to, if they're looking for shootings, how would they respond to those kinds of things? And so I guess it's another information overload question, but is that what happens with officers? Is that how you manage them?
One thing about the model is that it is creating areas that the model thinks are most at risk for violence, just like the subject prediction risk model. This can be overridden by people. So this is an input, and I just want to make one point to the professor's comment earlier. So what he's talking about is we call it a gun call-in, where criminals who've been arrested and charged with gun crimes are essentially called in, and they're on probation. And they're told if you commit future violence, you could be subject to enhanced penalties. There's also intervention services, et cetera. But the critical point here is that the risk model, the model itself is just one of the ways that you get prioritized for that call-in. And in fact, there's 6 or 7 other ways that are all based on people's intuition and people's assessment. So it is not the computer saying you're going to be called in. Instead, the computer is making some suggestions, people review it, along with a bunch of other information and say, okay, we think this person is at incredible risk for these reasons. This person should be warned. They should be notified. So the model is not the only thing, both on the person-based model and the place-based model, is not the only thing that is making the recommendations. It's just one of the inputs into this overall decision process. And it's really, we call it a special attention. So it doesn't mean you're going to flood that area with resources. Doesn't mean you're going to pick certain officers that are better with violent crimes and send them there. It's a special attention. What I believe is, so the model changes its geography 3 times a day. Whether it's predictive or not, what I can show is that it's increasing what I call mobility. So I can prove that the officers are moving around more now, partly because we're tracking where they're going more, we're paying more attention to how much time they're spending in certain areas and what they're doing when they're there. So even if these are not the greatest areas of risk, which maybe they're not, they're at least causing the officers to change be more mobile, increase presence in more areas of the geography, and I think that's making a huge difference. And we can show, and RAND is actually doing an evaluation funded by Bureau of Justice Assistance of the impact of the SDSCs, which won't be published for a while, but based on the preliminary results, which I'm allowed to talk about, it is going to show a significant positive impact of the SDSCs on crime reduction.
Robert Lee, let's talk about wraparound services. In your church, you do a lot of work with exactly what they're describing about finding folks who either have been through the system, have been incarcerated, or there's a potential that that's where they're going to go to come into that space and get the assistance they need. How crucial is this kind of information and for that kind of work? And do you feel like that should be just as much a part of this policing dynamic as the police having this information, that it's important for the community to also have access to it as well?
Well, and I think we have a model of it in Prince George's County. In Prince George's County, we have what's called the Transforming Neighborhoods Initiative. TNI was a way, and it really actually came out of the police department, but then was housed under the county exec and kind of housed in county government. But what it was they were looking at this kind of data, but realized, and this is the chief saying that they could not arrest themselves out of the crime issue.
Yeah.
But there was a need to be able to utilize this kind of data and utilize data, big data in general, and look at neighborhoods where there were issues, but not just do a typical hotspot initiative in which you just sent police, but do the kind of hotspot initiative in which you sent services. And not just the kind of services in which you brought people into a room and said, hey, choose this or this, but the kind of services in which you use data as a county. It's a way of relooking at government. in which it doesn't cost more. It's just reallocating resources. It's being able to look at government, being able to say, okay, in this community, we got these calls for these needs, whether it was needs around social services needs, whether it was needs around the trash cans didn't get picked up in time, and then being able to utilize data as a way to then route to whatever government resources to make sure certain things happen in those communities. And what we watched in Prince George's County, they actually did a press conference at my church about this kind of community policing relationships, is that we watched the crime across all levels in 7 years drop 50%.
It's at a historic low in Prince George's County. It's had some of the lowest drops in the nation with the work that they were able to do. And they said that T&I had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, and we felt that. So my church is smack dab in the middle of two hot spots. So when I first came in, we saw the hot spots. Hillcrest Heights, Suitland, we're right there. We're inside of a shopping mall, so we get everything. But in that, as we started working with the police, and it allowed us then to also see what the police needed. And so then the church was able to do community walks with the police. The church would buy the ice cream truck, walk with the chief of police through the community, and we were giving out free ice cream so the community could have interaction with the police department in non-confrontational kind of settings. And then we developed this kind of relationships that ended up paying dividends in the long run. But I really believe I believe technology is helpful. I believe it's important, but I believe it needs to be connected to more than just policing. But if you look at it and you look at it being shaped to other government services and other care providers, et cetera, faith, community, social, et cetera, then I believe that it can have the kind of impact that we've watched in Prince George's County.
Chief, I have a question for you about officers who are tied to their computer. So I have a two-part question. You were talking about the officers moving around more, but they're not on foot. They're in their vehicles.
Primarily, yeah.
I have heard from chiefs of police, there different ideas about whether it makes sense to walk the beat and if that's what people still should be doing, officers still should be doing, or if it should be more about that relationship with the computer. So the first part of my question is, how important is it to have the beat officers who are going door to door, who are, meeting people in the community as opposed to being stuck to those computers?
That's critically important. And to the Reverend's point, none of this replaces community policing. That is a central part of what we're doing and what every department should be doing. If you walk just a few steps down the hall here, you'll see a community policing exhibit at this museum, and Chicago is one of 5 cities that's featured there. So we have a strong community policing program. Is there room for improvement? Of course, just like in any program, there's room for improvement. We don't want officers having relationships with computers. We want officers having relationships with people, with the community. And to your question about foot officers, of course you want to do that. You want to be going door to door. You want to get to know the community. In a huge geography, Chicago is almost 250 square miles. Not as big as LA or New York, but it is still a huge geography. Some of our busy districts, you would need a lot of officers. We have added 1,000 additional officers. We're at 13,002 budgeted strength now. But even with that number of officers, you still have to have officers in cars that can cover geography and be able to respond to calls. But of course, you want officers on the street walking around.
Tell me, and I just want some inside gossip, so please be honest with me. How difficult was it when you all started to introduce this to your officers? I mean, did you have older officers who felt like this isn't the way you police?
Yes.
And exactly. Okay. And how much of an issue has it been for the younger officers who are coming in and the older officers who are there to help train them? The different cultures coming together to get this work done.
So I'm going to quote my superintendent, Eddie Johnson, who says there's 2 things officers hate: change and the way things are. So some of the officers love it, some of them hated it. But once they started seeing that it was making a difference, and I think the way that I knew that they had bought into it was when our police union, the Fraternal Order of Police, featured 2 officers on the west side of the city in the 11th Police District, Garfield Park. They featured them and the SDSC Center in their monthly publication, which I asked them for permission to use, and they gave it to me. They allowed me to use it. But we don't get to control, of course, what they publish. They choose whatever they want. And they chose this program to feature. So once you've got the union support, once you've got the officers buy into it, they see that it's making a difference. They see that it's saving lives. 1,400 fewer shooting victims from 2018 versus 2016. 2016 in Chicago was a terrible year. We had 768 homicides. Something had to change. If technology can play a role in helping us save lives, I think we have an obligation to use it responsibly within legal parameters and with the appropriate controls in place. But I think we have to use it.
Professor Ferguson, I want to ask you about what you see as the biggest concern here for the community. And well, so let me frame the question differently. I feel that it would probably be important for the community to be in on these conversations about what's happening with this. How can folks insert themselves into this conversation and make sure that the decisions that are being made with this kind of technology, that they're not excluded from those conversations?
Well, this is a question that every city will face. And in my book, I sort of pitch this idea that before we adopt these technologies, there should be sort of democratic oversight, right? We should make sure that the city council knows what we're using taxpayer dollars for. We should have an open hearing where the chief has to defend, like, this is why we put 30,000 surveillance cameras in this area.
Can today count as my hearing?
No. But you can them. Recognizing it will be difficult, and recognizing there are going to be community groups that are going to be frightened of this, recognizing that the ACLU and other civil liberties suits are going to point out the concerns. But you should have to justify. You should say, look, we think putting 50,000, I can't remember what it is, 50,000 surveillance cameras that are networked in these community areas is worth the resources, because that money could be used for libraries or after school programs or other things. We think this is right. This is why we think it is. There are too many people dying. This is why we justify it. And we want to be able to have that sort of political openness where you sit there and say, we think that this, strategic subjects ranking list, said no longer list is important. And again, you have to get past the concerns, because the flip side response is, if you are on this list, not a list, if you're on this list, this non-list, you get a threat score. Like, it's literally a number that's attached to your name. And so it's from 0 to 500 plus.
It's no longer a number. It's a risk tier.
All right, last
we
year
took the number out.
That, right? But this is what was scary, and this is not a bad thing to change, right? The original idea of when it was called the heat list, I can say it, was a creation of a bunch of sociologists and data scientists in academia who said, Chicago is a special place because the shootings are in small groups of retaliatory communities. And it's really like kind of a public health issue. Like, we can almost see that if you were living next to a, cancer-causing plant, like, maybe we should deal with the underlying issue. And violence was thought of as a public health approach. So this is how it became, right? Mm-hmm. And the variables have changed over time. But there have been moments where the variables and the way it's been done has, I think, needed a bit more discussion, right? And to me, one of the things that worried me was at a moment where you were using threat scores. Like, if you got pulled over, like, literally on the dashboard, you could see the score. If you were at 500 plus or whatever it is.
Not in the car. It wasn't. Officers did not use that when they were driving around on the street.
Oh, well, all right, right. And it resulted in knocks on your door, right? By detectives.
Not by detectives. Or by social service providers.
Social service.
So the point, I just have to interrupt for 1 second if I can. So the point I've got to reinforce here is that this is an intervention tool. This is not an enforcement tool. No longer a list. There's not a numeric score anymore. These are things that the model has evolved to. And I really hate the fact that we're focusing on this model, because this is a tiny, tiny part of a very comprehensive crime control strategy that is showing results in saving lives. And frankly, the heat list, we learned some lessons and we did some things that we shouldn't have done, and we corrected them. And we're transparent with the model. It's available publicly. We're showing the variables that are in the model. This is grant funded. It's designed to try to improve what technology can do to save lives. And again, if there's a way that police can use information that they have that has been used for centuries to more effectively, more objectively, and more strategically intervene to reduce the likelihood that somebody's going to be shot, we have an obligation to do that.
And I agree with that. And I think you should say exactly that this is your question, to the community. And say, this is why we think we're right. And maybe we took some missteps here, and this is how we changed it. And like, everyone should do that, right? You shouldn't be bought into what you did wrong, and you should recognize this is what data does. You change your model when it doesn't work. And you change your inputs when it's called out as maybe a problem. And that's a good thing. But my point is, like, the conversation we're having now is a good conversation. It's changing, and you're moving forward. But those conversations will happen in Baltimore, in DC, in Philadelphia, and other places that are going to adopt these models. And we should have a moment where the people who know that this isn't some scary minority report, it's actually something far more boring and far more basic. But that's a good thing, right? And it's about identifying young people so they don't die, which is a good thing, right? But that conversation can be had in an open way. And my idea is that we should bring the community in before, because if you go to the first hearing about this, we will spend the whole time talking about Minority Report and scary threat scores, right? We will, because it's part of every conversation, right? But if you get down to the ground of it, this is about risk. It's about identifying risk in smart ways, and there are smart ways to do it, and there are dumb ways to do it, and there are ways to change to get to be a smarter. And like, that's the conversation we should be having. But I think it should be a democratic conversation and a public conversation. And so my push is not we shouldn't do it, is that we should be doing it in a way that we don't have to keep changing the models, although I'm sure we will keep changing it, and we keep doing the best that we can do with the information we have.
Chief, when you meet with other chiefs who are watching what you all are doing, and you get together and have conversations about how this can work in other districts across the country, what are they most concerned about? What is it that they're watching and waiting to see perfected before they bring it into their own communities?
Well, with again, there's not a ton of talk about the risk model, and you kind of hit on it on the person-based risk model. Chicago has a pretty unique set of crime characteristics, and this, another point that you kind of alluded to, is that this work with this network of risky people actually started with Dr. Andrew Papachristos, who at the time was at Yale, unless you have somebody who started it before.
No, he's doing it. He's still.
So his model was just making connections across people that have been arrested together and showing nodes that have had a lot of connections, thinking that those people might be the most important in the network to intervene with. So this is not new. He was just using kind of co-arrest to connect people together. So what we started thinking is, could this become more predictive instead of just analyzing what's already happened? Could it become proactive and predictive? So that's kind of the history of the predictive model for people-based. What a lot of departments are interested in now that we talk to around the U.S. and even around the world is more the strategic use of all the information sources like surveillance cameras, gunshot detection, place-based risk models, this daily intelligence cycle, which is a really central part of our strategic decision support center process, an integration platform that ties all this together, mobile technology. Those are the things they're interested in, and what they're really concerned about is cost.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah, that's
it's money.
Yeah, because they already have all that information, and it's this model and this I almost said it myself. This risk score is it's scary because people don't understand it.
Right.
Once we start explaining it, it is kind of mundane. It is kind of boring. There's only a handful of variables in there. It's not magic. It's not this secret thing. It's pretty straightforward. People are really excited about all the other stuff. Like, how do we tie together technology and data that departments have had for a long time to make it more effective? Cost is really the biggest concern.
We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.